Welcome and thanks for joining us for part one of our discussion with the Health and Human Services Department. My guest is Dr. George Chambers, Executive Director of Application and Platform Solutions at HHS. Dr. Chambers, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And let's talk about maybe the scope of HHS in case people aren't fully aware of it, and also how the whole COVID episode of several years might have accelerated the adoption of cloud by HHS headquarters and the components, and how things stand now.
Sure, and I think the question is very germane to what took place during the pandemic. We have 11 operating divisions across the nation, going from NIH and CDC and CMS, which many people are familiar with, and FDA as well, all the way to IHS, which is the Indian Health Service. So we have the spectrum of not just the research, not the alerts and the recognition of a pandemic's oncoming, but we also have to deal with the clinical implementations. We have to deal with bedside service, and we also deal with the payer end of it with CMS. What the pandemic did, it became a convergence of all those things and the need for real-time systems to deal with them at pace during the escalation of the pandemic. So how is this related to the cloud? What we found ourselves having to do is being able to report from multiple systems across the nation, real time with external systems, in particular, thousands of hospitals across the country, where we're trying to understand what was going on at the time and be able to report that to the task force. My team using new tools, and I'm not going to go into the technologies that we bought. It's not fair to a lot of the vendors who are supporting us now and have been supporting us, and those that we brought on during the pandemic. But needless to say, our ability to use data stores within the cloud and exchanges that were cloud-based, and the tools that were provided for analytics were critical in our ability to respond to the pandemic. And I guess that sort of speaks to, are we so lucky that we had the pandemic from that perspective, that it boosted us into the cloud? That's not just the case. I'll say it accelerated for sure. But the whole notion of cloud went well beyond, oh, you're going to save some money in the cloud. As a matter of fact, you really don't save money in the cloud per se, but what it does is enable the costs that you have already incurred and the costs that you will incur. It allows you and it enables you to have a broader spectrum. Your reach increases. Your ability to interact with internal and external organizations becomes paramount. And so we had a roadmap to the cloud. All of government with a cloud first or cloud right adoption incentive, we're always looking at the cloud as being an opportunity. But the reality of, or the necessity of the cloud during the pandemic just bolstered and reinforced that need. And so our plans continue to be cloud first where it's appropriate and possible.
I guess HHS can be characterized as both an operational agency in some of the aspects of the different components, and also a giant research agency. And so would you say then that one of the challenges accelerated by the pandemic, but really extant before that, is the need for a data integration mechanism such that research and operation can inform one another and keep the missions moving forward?
Yeah, you'll see that many of our comprehensive cancer centers are tied to NIH, not just by the grants that they receive, but through the data and exchanges that take place. You bring up an interesting concept about boundaries when you mentioned operational versus research and patient side care. And it's something that is maybe part of our culture is you have systems, and systems tend to be uh, geographic from a boundary standpoint. You know,
Mhm.
those that use it, those that really don't. And in research, cloud use was adopted pretty early because you just didn't have the computing power of, Linux clusters at your disposal. They're very expensive, and, high performance computing is needed when you're doing molecular modeling, for example, where you're trying to combat cancers and you're trying to understand where you have opportunities. And then genomics, of course, was also another enabler in terms of cloud computing. And so you had cloud computing, and it was very specific. But when you start thinking about the pandemic and you start talking about HHS as a whole, the boundaries need to open up, right? You need to be able to get access to not only some of the research data for potential interventions and or cures, but you also need to have awareness of all the research that's going on, not just individual labs. And so I don't think we've cracked that nut, Tom. I think that in essence, that's still part of our evolution in our cultural habits of looking at systems very specific to a mission and not necessarily, and rightfully so, right? There are boundaries, just like countries have boundaries, systems have boundaries because there are also vulnerabilities, right? That's the security aspect of a system. And you don't want to have just everybody in and out of your systems. So you have to protect them. But we also have to think about when we establish our systems in the cloud, which can open up those boundaries, what securities we're laying in that doesn't prohibit. And here's the key: doesn't, how should I say, should allow the expansion or opening up of those systems and that data for additional uses that weren't necessarily first thought about. Did that speak a little bit to your question line there?
Yes, it did, because you do have boundaries, but at the same time, what I was driving at is that some of the work in research can result in benefit to operations, and what is the feedback from operations can feed back into further research. So I see it as more of a perhaps data integration, but not necessarily an application integration. And so
Right.
therefore you maintain the boundaries among applications and systems, but data is a kind of commons that someone with the right rights could access.
So it's interesting that you say that, right? Because that's also culture, right? Data and data use agreements. And I'm not the chief data officer for HHS, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express, so I can speak to the area. Now, the whole notion of data and being open is what you want to see is an objective, a goal. But ultimately, it has to go through phases of protection and identification and de-identification and all the things of protections in order for that data to be opened up appropriately. And you also have to protect the data in terms of its integrity because of the research that's taking place, right? And there's also intellectual protections, intellectual property rights too, when you're dealing with data, especially when you have, commercial industries all dependent on their ability to deliver products and services on behalf of the greater good in healthcare. So it isn't a small task. It's a significant aspect. What we've done, because you talked about systems versus the data, in many ways, you'll see an emergent practice of data exchanges, right? Protected data exchanges in the cloud, where you can in fact put data out there that is already been culled, already been curated, and is available for consumption. And then you can pinpoint those recipients so they can start to consume. And you can add or take away depending on what you need. That's a technology or a use of the technology that I see becoming more and more prevalent.
And let me just ask you about some of the organizational aspects of this. There is an office of the CIO at HHS. How does your unit there, the Health and the Application and Platform Solutions Group, relate to the OCIO? And how do decisions get made for cloud adoption, cloud strategy, cloud technologies?
Well, so you're bringing up that's a large question and a good one. And a good one. HHS is highly federated. So you have the central HHS OCIO, the Office of the CIO, my boss, Carl Mathias. Dr. Mathias and I work hand in hand. And what we do is we try to enable shared services that can be consumed by any of the operating divisions. But the operating divisions also have their own IT shops. They have a named CIO, and there is a reporting relationship between Carl and the Optiv chief information officers, along with those who are direct reports to him at headquarters. So the idea is we want to be the leader of the willing, right? We're there. We don't tend to try to use the heavy stick and mandate you will use this system operating divisions under these conditions in order for you to achieve your mission. In essence, they have their own expertise that will allow them to achieve their mission. And it's our job to not only provide oversight so things don't go completely off rail, but to enable shared services. So, for example, when dealing in the pandemic with foreign nationals coming from other countries to help with the research, my team put together a foreign national management system quickly, within weeks, in order for us to manage the foreign nationals coming in and out of our various locations and be credentialed and things of that nature. So, once again, how you see our team fit is we put bridges where there are gaps. We provide shared services where there is a need. Even if it's just one operating division, we will build it so others can use those shared services. We also have data marts that we provide to the enterprise at whole. Most of those are administrative data, like, for example, our HR data, our financials data, and they are consumed by the operating divisions along with their own data sets. But that's sort of how that relationship works, is highly federated and leading among the willing. I think those are the two key points to HHS.
And when you maintain the boundaries and people have their own hierarchies and budgets and so forth, outside of the shared services and the data marts that are available, do you also share best practices, even though it might be replicated with someone else's budget in their own context, their own cloud instances and contracts? But nevertheless, there's a lot to learn from one another.
Tom, you're spot on. We need to be very agile in our ability to coordinate and our ability to provide information across the enterprise. And so our team does, in fact, and I use the word coordinate because we're not the tip of the spear in innovation. We're not the tip of the spear necessarily in all best practices, but we are compelled where we can to share those best practices. And we have infrastructure in place through our enterprise life, EPLC, process life cycle program, the EPLC enterprise process life cycle, where where we will look at initiatives across the board, and where there are best practices or compelling technologies being used, we have the ability to then share those outside of those practices. And all operating divisions do participate in that.
Interesting. Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's that kind of exchange of knowledge, if you will, even if
Yes.
everyone is federated and the boundaries can get a little complicated, but yet you talk to each other basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I tell you, we haven't fully automated that sharing of knowledges and best practices, even though we are moving toward having those toolkits be
Mhm.
cloud enabled and available to everybody. That is part of our plan as we go forward and establish standards. We will, we're looking at the enterprise architecture group and whether or not we will uh, fortify its current capabilities in order to address some of the things that you're talking about, technology roadmaps, best practices, and how we can not only consume, but also distribute. And I think that's a work in progress. And Carl and I have had those conversations. And I think that may be an opportunity for us moving forward.
Okay. And earlier you said that this was not a budget idea. The move to the cloud and the acceleration was not for budget, but for other reasons. I guess my question then is, what is your evaluation process? What's your decision tree for saying this workload, this mission, or this set of applications needs to be either moved to the cloud, refactored for the cloud, redeveloped for the cloud, or replaced as a cloud service commercially, whatever the range of options might be. But how do you make the decision on this should be in the cloud?
The question is really prospective versus retrospective consideration, right? Right now, we will invest in a mission technology or enablement, and that has to go through an assessment of alternatives. So from a prospective standpoint, we are making those type of decisions in advance before we're spending the money, because money is dear and it's taxpayer money from a government perspective. And so the idea is, let's look at the alternatives and make sure that we're looking at the total life cycle cost, and will that cloud enablement get you there quicker, better, faster, with more capability. Not everything is going to go into the cloud, and there are reasons for not going into the cloud, whether it's uh, proprietary protection or need or specific use, like I mentioned before. In labs, sometimes you have a proximity requirement as well. But what I will say is, in retrospective, the whole rationalization of what you have in terms of legacy systems, that is a mountain that we are chipping away at as well. And I can't give you the specific criteria in terms of, when a legacy system needs to be modernized, right? Which is really what you were asking is, when am I going to not just modernize it, but how am I going to modernize it? And a shift to the cloud, is that a good first move, or is that after a rewrite with cloud tools and cloud technologies? And that's part of the question that we do ask, especially for high valued assets. We have named the number of systems that are high value that are also shared among the agencies. So your high valued assets are well documented and known. And those are ones that are going to get that rationalization view earlier versus later, right? You pick your priorities and you look at those priorities, and those systems where we can, we have moved a number centrally. My team has been responsible for moving in the past year and a half, 2 years, probably 35 to 40 systems to the cloud. Those legacy systems represented an opportunity for cloud enablement without having to be fully rewritten. So there were benefits for that. But some are legacy systems can't really move well to the cloud and would have to be replaced. And those will have to go a different timeline. So I think the opportunities are there for a retrospective look, but at least the audience can understand that we are upfront in a prospective fashion, making sure that the things that need to go into the cloud or should go into the cloud are being adopted. And there's one other aspect. It's almost like OBE. They use that like government terms, overcome by events. The realities are the tools that are most productive, the tools that will enable our organization to be successful. Many of those are cloud centric, right? That they're native to the cloud. That's where you will find them. And so you're not going to go invest and build that infrastructure from scratch. So you're going to make the best use of the new technologies and the best tools that are out there, and most have been enabled into the cloud by those vendors and by those producers. So it's almost like, even if I don't put a system in the cloud, I'm going to use tools from the cloud to develop that system to make it ready and mission worthy.
Sure. Because of the dynamic way in which the commercial cloud providers are adding services all of the time, that's got to be part of the calculus as to what is the environment that I'm targeting to move an application to, because that's not really static. As time goes on, it might become more and more amenable, and suddenly that old application there, well, now we can do it.
Well, not only that, but then you have to keep track of all your cloud service providers, right? Because there's not just one cloud, right? I mean, there are a plethora of cloud. FedRAMP for us, right? We want to have at least it's meeting security, credentialing and certification. So we go with FedRAMP approved cloud environments, but you have low, moderate, and FISMA high cloud environments that are appropriate for your mission. And you have providers that will give you access to the cloud. And there are multiple cloud providers, right? I mean, you have Azure and you have AWS and you have, Oracle Cloud and Google. And so we are not in the business of trying to pick the best vendor and the best technology. It's really about what lines up best with the mission, right? It's really about mission specific. And so we have to be not only well versed in what technologies are available to us, but then the other part of your question, which is really, now how do you keep track of it all? Right? And how do you use tools across cloud platforms? And that's part of what the vendors need to start thinking about for consumers like the government, is how do we make your tool sets available across cloud environments? And so, I may pick one here, but I may pick another here. And how do I use those in concert with each other and not necessarily be locked into that one environment, that one platform? And so there are tools that we are procuring and we are using that go cross cloud in many perspectives. And
well, I want to pull on that thread a little bit more, but right now we need to take a short break. My guest is George Chambers. He's Executive Director of Application and Platform Solutions at Health and Human Services. We're going to be back more with Dr. Chambers after this industry perspective. So back to the studio now for more on the Cloud Exchange.